Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and to be sharing what we've been working on with Analog today. This talk is called the Vite-powered Meta Framework, and before I get into it, a couple of things about me. My name's Robin. I'm a full-stack developer. I'm from Augsburg, Germany, which is like 8-hour train ride south if you go with the Deutsche Bahn. I work with Angular and Java. I love hiking. In my free time, I'm part of the Analog team, and I created a UI library that's sort of like taken over my life that I call Spartan UI. I'm also on Twitter if you want to chat anything about Angular, Analog, or full-stack development. Feel free to follow me there and reach out to me there. All right, so this talk has 3 parts. We're going to talk about what it means to be Vite-powered. We're going to talk a little bit about Angular, and also what is a meta framework. We're going to start with the easiest. We all know and love Angular, or at least we're forced to work with it. And Angular is actually pretty cool. We talked about the Angular momentum, the Angular renaissance, but the way I understand Angular is that it's a batteries-included framework to build front-end applications. And we actually get a lot out of the box. If you look at the other JavaScript frameworks, with Angular we have what they call opinionated solutions for almost everything, right? We have the core, we have components, dependency injection, change detection is part of that. It's sort of like everything that gives you the tools to structure your application and synchronize your application state with the DOM. We get a data fetching solution with the HTTP client that lets you fetch data from a remote location and returns it as an observable. We have not 1, but 2 form solutions. We have template-driven forms, and then also reactive forms. We have a router who takes care of updating the view as the user navigates the page. All of that is built into the framework. And as we heard, we also have an SSR story that's improving more and more. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Server-side rendering, as we heard, means that your application and its current state are rendered on the server into HTML that is then returned to the browser, which is great for search engine optimization and also performance, because we can show the page really, really quickly. And we heard about the story of Angular SSR, how it was universal, and it sort of all was built around Express. So Angular has an official Express adapter that allows you to render Angular components on the server. And as we see, this is a new focus, and if you go to angular.dev, the new documentation page, it's front and center that you now build on the built-in hydration of the framework. And that is non-destructive hydration. And if you were wondering what we had before version 16 of Angular, this is what happened if you used Angular Universal. So you had the HTML when it loaded, and then Angular actually destroyed the whole DOM structure and recreated it in JavaScript, and you had this flash, which was really bad user experience and really bad for your performance. But like we said, in version 16, this was fixed, and this flash is gone. It's a thing of the past. So we're actually, with this non-destructive hydration and server-side rendering, it feels like we're ready to really become the framework of builders, right? And it's, again, in the documentation, it lets you start small, which I really like because I'm a tinkerer myself, and I'm actually completely bought into the lean startup methodology of build, measure, learn. So I like to build my ideas in the weekend, see if it provides value, learn a bunch, and then iterate from there. And I would love to do this without having to set up a whole Spring Boot app, Nginx to serve my Angular application, and take care of all of that infrastructure. I would love to just click a button or push to main and have it ready to go, right? Problem is, we're not quite there yet, all right? Angular's SSR story and server integration is improving, but like we heard before, Angular is still a framework that's concerned about building front-end applications. What we actually need is a server, right? Or a meta framework that brings a server with it. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, pun intended. Because if you're a Vue developer, if you're still around from VueConf, Nuxt is actually the definition of a meta framework. All right, so we're on to the next one, meta frameworks. What is it, right? And Ben Holmes from Astro is also a new meta framework, has a very good definition. It's a system one level above that stitches multiple frameworks together. And that is exactly what Nuxt is in the Vue ecosystem. Because Vue itself describes itself as a progressive JavaScript framework that has an incrementally adoptable ecosystem that scales between a library and a full-featured framework. So what the heck does that mean? If we only take Vue, it's actually just a library that is concerned with the view, right? Updating the DOM, reflecting application state. To go to a full-fledged meta framework, we need to add data fetching, file-based routing, server rendering, server routes, middleware, all of that stuff, right? To really be able to build applications with Vue. And that is what Nuxt is, right? It's a full-stack meta framework to build production-grade applications. But with all these like battery packs, right? Nuxt looks more like Angular, right? So the question is Angular actually a meta framework itself? Because it brings so much with it. It actually also has a CLI and takes care of that for you, right? But I would say not quite yet. The reason is that server-side story, it's missing that Nuxt-level server integration. And specifically, up until now, it was hybrid rendering, static site generation, and then API routes and server-side data fetching. And we see the team is working on these things, and some of these things are coming. But there's still work to do, and I like to build my stuff now. And that's where Analog comes in, right? Because Analog brings that Nuxt-level server integration to Angular today. And it does so with Nitro. Has anyone ever heard of Nitro? All right, a couple guys. So Nitro is a next-generation server toolkit. And it's extremely hackable. And it's actually made by the creators of Nuxt. It's what powers Nuxt. So if you know Nuxt, you're actually using Nitro under the hood. Or if you look into the React ecosystem, one thing that's really getting some attention right now is TanStack Start. They're also going to build on Nitro. And actually, the Angular team is also looking at Nitro to build their official solution. Like I said, what makes Nitro so powerful is that it's extremely hackable. You can configure everything, right? And one example is a custom renderer. So Nitro is your server, and if a request hits the server and there's no API route defined, it falls back to a custom renderer. And that is actually what Analog does. It hooks into that and then tells Nitro how to render your Angular application. So you get server-side rendering with Nitro and Angular. But there's so much more to configure, right? Nitro has the concept of route rules, which are an incredibly powerful way to configure the way you want to render or customize caching at a route level. So you can actually, for every route, decide how you want it to be served. So let's say you have a static landing page and you simply want to pre-render it during build time. You can just put that in the route rules, and that Nitro is just going to serve those static files. You can also tell Nitro to cache specific routes if the data doesn't change as frequently. Or you fall back to server-side rendering, right? So you really have a strong SSR and SSG, static site generation story here. Gives you all the flexibility you would need. But we all need an API, right? And Nitro doesn't only render your Angular pages, but it allows you to create your own API routes. And it's very easy because it's the same folder, or it's the same source directory that you create your Angular application in. You just create a server folder. Inside of the server folder, you create a routes folder. And then we're going to use that folder structure and those file names to actually translate that into your API routes. So all that's left to do to get the talks from your database is this. You define an event handler, and in here, you're actually on your server, so you can, for example, query your talks from the database and return them as JSON. And I'm going to show you really quick how that is done. So over here on the left, I'm just in like in an analog app that looks like a regular Angular application. You have your angular.json, and you have the source folder that we know. And inside here, I have a server directory, and then I have that routes v1 talks. And in here, I define an event handler. So when I hit that endpoint, it actually queries the talks from the database and returns them as JSON. So if I go to my browser and I refresh this, I see all the talks from this conference, right? So this is Nitro in action. Cool. Let me, oops. All right, so we have file-based routing for our server. But of course, we also want the same thing for a client to sort of like make it easier on us, keep that same frame of mind. And that's possible too. So if I go back to the source folder, I can also create an app directory that hosts my Angular application. In there, I create a pages directory to sort of tell Analog that I'm going to put the pages in here, so turn these into routes. So I can have a talks.page.ts in what we call a routeless subfolder, and we end up with just the talks route. There's no manual wiring up. There's no route files. We use naming conventions and folder structure to, again, come up with the ultimate route. And yeah, by putting your files in the right place, you can actually structure your Angular application. And again, I'm going to show you guys really quick what that looks like. So if I go into my app folder, I have a pages directory. I have a talks folder. If I put parentheses around it, I can group stuff without creating an actual path segment for it. And then I have talks.page.analog. I'm going to go into that a little more later. But over here, if I now go to the talks route, I get the talks page, and it's server-side rendered. It's server-side rendered because we see our talks here, and there's no API call, right? So this is Nitro now, server-side rendering my Angular application. Again, everything controlled by just the folder structure and the file names. All right. Cool. So you might have noticed that there's also this weird talks.server.ts file in there. And there's another really cool feature that Analog gives you out of the box, and it's server-side data fetching. So I can actually co-locate the server-side data fetching with the actual component where I need that data. And again, it's very easy to set this up. I can just define a load function similar to what Remix does in the React world. And it allows us to fetch data that is then passed to the components as we load the page. Again, this runs on the server. So in here, you can query the database or a cache to get this data. And I can show you guys one more time what that looks like. So in here, I have a talks.server.ts, and it looks very similar, right? And I'm using that to get the talks from the database. And then in my component, instead of, I can actually use input binding to get that data from a resolver and get that data into my component before it even loads. Cool. All right, but we're not done yet because you get all of this functionality and it comes with 0 config deploys to all the big cloud providers. So you don't have to set up anything yourself. You can deploy to Cloudflare, Firebase, Netlify, or Xerox with one click, or Vercel if you want to do that. You can really set it up super quickly, and you really get that next level developer experience and server integration. So Analog actually turns Angular into a powerful full-stack meta framework that lets you build your ideas in the weekend and sort of like deploy it with one click or one push to main. All right, so we talked about Angular. We now know what meta frameworks are. But what does it mean to be Vite powered, right? What is the magic that sort of ties all of this together? Lets us use our file system to create routes, or sort of like wire up Nitro with Angular. So the question is, what is Vite? And Vite is French, and it means quick. And it's a build tool, but it's actually much more than that. It has 2 parts. It has a dev server, and it also has a build command. And the dev server is so good, it actually now powers ngserve. Why is it so good, and how does it do that? So instead of bundling everything up front, even in dev, like Webpack did, it lets the browser do the work. So what do I mean by that? What Webpack does is it traverses all your source files in your repository and then creates a bundle for them, even on development. And that can get pretty slow if you have huge applications. Vite actually does something very different. It leverages new browser technology to avoid having to do all that work up front. So it gives you a dev server that's instantly ready. And then only upon requesting the route, it fetches and transpiles only the modules that are needed to make the current route work. So even as your application grows larger and larger, only the source code that's currently needed needs to be converted to ECMAScript modules that then the browser can parse and use. But it's even a little bit smarter than that, because we don't want to clog up fetching hundreds of internal modules from our dependencies. If you think something like underscore can get pretty big. And we don't want to overwhelm the browser with having to fetch these, like this source code, especially because our dependencies often don't change very much. So what Vite does, it pre-bundles your dependencies with ESBuild, which is a really fast bundler written in Go that's really good at parallelizing work. So that's also something that's a little bit confusing. Vite actually uses ESBuild as part of its dev server. But it does that to pre-bundle your dependencies and sort of like open up some of the capacity for your browser to just fetch those source code files. So ultimately, Vite, dev server stays quick, right, even for huge applications. And then we have the build command. So once we're done developing, we're ready to build our application. And Vite brings a very optimized by default and highly customizable bundler, which is not ESBuild. It's called Rollup. And Rollup has a huge strength in that it's plugin interface. There is a plugin for literally everything that you want to customize within your build, there's a plugin, there's a rollup plugin for it. And Vite does something very smart because it provides a rollup compatible interface for its dev server too, so you can really customize how your dev server behaves, but also what happens during the build command. And that means Vite has a massive ecosystem of rollup and Vite plugins that can be used to customize our builds and developer experience. And that is really what makes Analog special, because Analog turns Angular into a Vite plugin. So it tells Vite how to use Angular for development, but also how to build your Angular applications with rollup. But there's one problem. Rollup is JavaScript, right? So it's not so quick, actually. And I hope this also explains why the Angular teams both announced Vite and ES build support with version 17, because it uses Vite to use the dev server and keep development super quick. But then uses Go, which compiles to native code, parallelizes a lot of the work, and keeps things very fast, even at a scale of like Google's applications, right? So Vite is actually an implementation detail for the Angular team, right? All of that is hidden behind the Angular CLI. So all you needed to do is change a couple files and run ngupdate to get Vite and ES build. And if the team ever decides to move away from it, all you're going to do is ngupdate and change a couple files, right? They want to make it really easy for you. That's why they sort of like see it as an implementation detail. But that means we also lose a lot of the customization that's possible, which is probably fine for 99% of enterprise application, but there is a whole Vite world out there. And that's what Angular is for, right? Analog is for. Analog gives you access because it turns Angular into a Vite plugin. And it's actually amazing what the Vite ecosystem has grown into, right? There's Vitest that you can use Angular with if you use the Analog Vite plugin. And we have tools like TanStack Query, which uses Vitest for their tests. So the Angular query adapter actually uses the Analog plugin to be able to run tests in the TanStack Query repository for Angular. There's Playwright component testing that runs on Vite. There's an Astro integration, right? So you can use Angular components with Astro thanks to Analog. And of course, you can do something like AnalogJs does, where you connect Angular with stuff like Nitro and give it a whole server and create full-stack meta frameworks. And there's one more thing that Vite allows us to do that I want to show you guys really quickly, and sort of hinted at this before. And if you were a Vue dev before, if you have worked with Vue before, the Analog team has experimented with a new file format that is very similar to Vue single file components that they call Angular single file components. It's a new way to think about authoring Angular components that has less boilerplate, single imports, and focuses on co-location. And thanks to Vite and Analog, I can show you them working in my Angular app today, which I actually already did. So if I go over here, you'll see that this is a weird-looking file and actually has the little view icon here. But this is an Angular component and Angular application. So we have a script tag, and then we have a template tag. And in here, I used a signal input, right? I used signal computed, and then I'm using this in the template. And the template's a little wild. I'm using a navigation component. I'm using a div, but I'm also using Markdown. And that is something we can do with the single file components, is we actually support this language tag Markdown where we can actually use Markdown next to our Angular components in our templates, right? And we compile this down to HTML. So you can see I have the for loop here. I have the to render out my talks, and all of this is actually then translated into a working Angular component. I have a little simpler one here that also shows you how you can use an effect or just the regular event listeners, like a click event listener where I increment the likes of the talks. So if I click on give a like, it actually increments the likes over here. And this analog file format is actually then turned into a normal Angular class component for you as you develop. And I'm actually going to show you that I'm not just making this up. But if I change it to a TypeScript file instead of an analog file, and I copy this, and I'm going to abuse Vite snapshot testing here. So I'm pasting in the contents of this component, and I run this snapshot test here. Test's going to fail because I just changed the contents, but I can grab this Angular class component that it created for me and pass this in over here. It looks a little weird because it does some authoring that we wouldn't do as humans, right? It puts everything in the constructor to wire things up. But if I save this, I go back to talks, it's still working, right? Because now I have transpiled my single file component into just a regular Angular component. But yeah, this is possible thanks to Analog and Vite. So this is actually something I love about this. It really allows you to build. It allows you to build ideas in a weekend. It allows you to test out new file authoring formats before the core team can make decisions. So it really enables you to try stuff. And that's what I want you to do. Try out Analog and let us know how you like it. Thank you.